We are really, really pleased and privileged to have been allowed into a private home somewhere in Dominica, from where we're shooting this program. And we want to say thank you to the hostess and owner of the place for allowing that. We have a guest this week who is an extraordinary Dominican. You will know him when I introduce him, not by his name. His name is George Brian Keith ALLEYNE. Welcome, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah. Look forward to our conversation. Brian has been in the news for all his life, and what we want to do with this conversation is to discover what that life meant for him, what it meant for Dominican, and of course, because he was Chief Justice, OECS acting, we want to talk to him about the implications, impressions, reflections of his life and his work for Dominica, the OECS, and of course beyond, because we are all humans, we're all on one earth, and actually we're going to be speaking with Brian about the lessons that he would like to share with us. So we're going to take a short break for a word from the sponsors who kindly make this program possible. And when we come back, we'll commence some reflections with George Brian Keith ALLEYNE on his life and work in Dominica, the OECS, and the wider Caribbean. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back. We're here, as I told you, with, let's get to his real name, Brian ALLEYNE, former acting Chief Justice of the OECS, Dominican attorney, but so much more about Brian that only he can tell us. Welcome again, Brian. Brian, we want to have a conversation with you that maybe we should have had many, many years ago, which would have placed your commentary on issues in Dominica society into a context that would have been helpful to those who don't know you personally. Because you are a public person, now retired, and congratulations on making it that far.
Thank you.
Let's talk about Brian. Let's talk about your journey. Go back as far as you care to, family, how you got into the profession of law, and what it did for you, what you did for it. Let's start there.
Thank you, Athi. Well, going right back, I was born in Dominica, but when I was about 2 years old, my family moved to St. Lucia, and my early schooling was in St. Lucia. Incidentally, at the school at which the mother of Derek Walcott was the headmistress.
Oh, no.
And my father and Derek were very close friends, and I remember as a very young boy, as a child, sitting on Derek's mother's veranda and listening to my father and Derek conversing. Most interesting, most stimulating conversations for me at the time.
How far back? Do you recall how old you were at that time?
Well, I must have been maybe 4 or 5 years old.
4 or 5 years old, okay.
Yeah, very young. And from there we moved to St. Vincent for a few years, and then on to Grenada. My father was a lawyer as well, and he held various positions in the public service, Crown Attorney, eventually Attorney General in Grenada. So my schooling was in the other islands.
Okay.
And I only visited Dominica occasionally. And well, my early inclination was not towards law at all. It was towards sciences, engineering or something of that nature.
Okay.
But before, just as I was getting ready to leave school, my godfather, who was himself a lawyer and a close family friend, called me and asked me what my inclination was. And I told him engineering, something like that. He said, why not law? And he got me thinking. He really pushed me, and well, he didn't push me, but he discussed the advantages and the love of the law that he clearly had. And I decided, all right, let me try that. It was in the family, my father himself and so on.
So you felt a little pressured, or just gently nudged in that direction?
Nudged.
Yeah, okay.
There was no pressure, no pressure. But so I decided to do law, and I did that. I spent 5 years in England. And having sort of grown up in Grenada, all my teenage years were in Grenada, and having very close friends, Morris Bishop, Kenrick Radix, people like that were my intimate friends in school, I would probably have returned to Grenada to work. But at the time, my father had set up his own law chambers here in Dominica. And he wrote me and said, I need you here. At the time, he was in he had been in partnership with Bobby Clark.
Okay.
And they'd had a fight. And he had thrown Bobby out of his chamber.
Now, some of our viewership don't know who Bobby Clark is, but we know who Bobby Clark is, and maybe that's a whole other conversation, right?
Yes, because those were two completely different characters.
Absolutely.
So it's not surprising that
it got to that point.
Yeah. So I had just got married, and we came back to Dominica to live. And
your wife, Brenda, was
her parents are Grenadian, but she was born in St. Vincent.
Okay. All right.
And we got to know each other in St. Vincent Primary School.
Okay.
And then as teenagers in Grenada when she would visit her family.
All right.
So our relationship goes way back to our infant years.
Right.
So we came to Dominica and settled into legal practice. And the rest is history.
At that time, Brian, what as you entered the profession, what was your sense of law? I asked that question because you talk to young lawyers, entrant lawyers today, and really they see it as an opportunity to earn some real money very quickly.
Yeah.
What was law to you then?
I think it was very different then, not only for me but generally. I remember, for instance, in my days in practice, before I got into politics and government, there's a very strong public interest law practice and constitutional law and human rights. And not only in Dominica, but throughout the region. There were lawyers from Jamaica, from Grenada, from St. Vincent, who would come into different islands and do work for just expenses, for instance. And they wouldn't charge large fees because it was the dedication to the subject on human rights issues. So I met a lot of very interesting lawyers, very high class, hardworking, competent lawyers in that area in those days. People from Jamaica, people from Trinidad, and the OECS countries as well. So, of course, money making was always part of the practice. It's a profession.
Of course.
And you get into the profession to make a living, and hopefully a decent living. But there was also a dedication to the law and to human rights and issues of that nature.
You hear a lot of talk these days, we may come back to this later, but I'll raise it now, about the rule of law. And the place of prominence that the law occupies in our culture, our society, even our perception of who we are, allowing law to shape who we are, as opposed to what I've heard from some international human rights lawyers. It's time for us to shape the law according to who we are. Is there a difference, and are we living that difference, or is the law so structured that we must stick with it no matter what? No, both perspectives are valid. The law is the law, and we are bound by it, and it arises from our experience. The law just doesn't come to us as from heaven. We shape the law, we make the law as parliamentarians, as practitioners, as people living in society. The law really reflects, or should reflect, our standards, principles, and so on. So, unfortunately, however, sometimes the law does not, the legislation and even the practice of the law does not reflect desirable standards, if I may put it that way. So, yes, we shape the law, but the law also shapes us. But as officers of the court, lawyers and people in the profession, I want to go back to your life journey a little bit, because there were some really significant moments in that life that I'd like you to sort of share with our viewers. You got into politics, which almost always seemed to be what lawyers do. Let's talk a little bit about that. What brought you in and what did you bring to the politics, and what did politics leave you with?
Yeah. Okay, in a sense, before politics, but maybe it's what brought me into politics in the end, was the era of the Dreads and the violence that surrounded that era and the conflict within the society. And I found myself dealing with the whole Dread issue in a number of ways. But I was the lawyer in those days who identified with the issues, the human rights issues surrounding the whole Dread situation.
These were the years of, just to place it for our viewers, in the 60s?
In the late 60s.
Late 60s.
Yes, early 70s.
Yeah.
And having become identified as representing the Dreads in all kinds of legal issues, played a sort of negative part on the business side of my practice. I lost clients.
You lost clients because of that.
Because of that.
Okay.
And some important, business clients who kind of supported my practice. So it was one of the consequences of taking a principled stand on issues that I saw as important. And I suppose that gave me an image. But what brought me into politics really was the 1979 events.
Okay.
Because prior to that, I wasn't really identified with any political movement or action or anything of the sort. But the events of 1979 absorbed me into the political area, and I became part of the Committee for National Salvation and became part of the interim government,
right.
In which I participated for quite a while. But then I resigned at a certain stage because I didn't like and couldn't work with some of the things that were happening. And by that time, I suppose I became identified with the Freedom Party and became a member of the Freedom Party.
Okay.
And contested the
elections of 1980.
1980.
Right, right. But let me ask you, while the 1979 events were unfolding here, they were another set of events were also unfolding in your other home, Grenada.
That's right.
The revolution in Grenada,
yes.
and so on. How did you straddle those events, and how did the dual, occurrence of these things affect you, shape you?
A little bit of background again. Both Morris Bishop and Kenrick Radix were very close friends of mine in school. We worked together, we played together. My first and only boxing experience was against Kenrick Radix. You know Kenrick, he's about 250 pounds.
Absolutely.
And I was a little fella.
That's a mismatch if I ever heard one. Yeah.
And he caught me one on my chin and dislocated my jaw for a while. I couldn't eat or... But anyhow, that's background. But we were very close friends, and I identified a lot with the revolution. My father was identified with Gary. He was in fact Gary's Attorney General for a while, so there was a lot of tension.
Absolutely.
At that time.
Both domestically for you.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Yes, and my sister, Kanda, was also very much part of the revolution in Grenada. She lived in Grenada at the time. So, there were tensions there. There were pressures. And in the end, I didn't like the direction the revolution was taking, and so I distanced myself from that. But however, I always remember after Hurricane David, Morris Bishop's visit to Dominica,
sure.
His participation, his growing friendship with Eugenia, and the assistance that Grenada gave us at that time.
Absolutely.
In the post-David events.
So it smoothed the passage for you somewhat?
It did,
yes.
It did.
Okay. And then Dominica, 1979, the interim government, the elections in 1980, you become a full-fledged minister in the Freedom Party government, led by Dame Eugenia. Then a period of what, 15 years in government?
Yes, yes, 15 years.
That had to have a significant influence on Brian ALLEYNE.
Oh yes, it did. I was very committed to the government. I thought the government was doing a lot of the right things, but there were also a lot of tensions and differences between Eugenia and myself, and there were elements, there were different perspectives within the government, and there were times when, for instance, I was Minister of Housing for a while, for 5 years, and in that period we were doing some housing development things, including Jimmet, the development of Jimmet as a community. And in that area, our different perspectives, Eugenia's and mine, clashed to some extent. For instance, I thought that housing development, especially for poor people, like the Jimmet area, should be more cost recovery rather than commercial, and that the pricing of the land and of the housing
should reflect
should reflect a cost recovery perspective rather than a commercial value of the land approach, which was Eugenia's perspective on it. So we differed in those areas. We argued somewhat on it. I remember that when there was the strike by the public service over salaries. And again, some differences emerged there. She had assigned Charles Maynard and me to negotiate with to talk, not negotiate, but to talk with the union, as well as with people like Ali Lazar and the the finance people in the government, which we did, and we intervened, and we thought we had come up with a solution.
Okay.
And when we went to her and explained to her what we thought was coming out of our discussions with both sides, she was very angry. She was very angry. And thought we had sold her out.
Okay.
And so on. So, these tensions arose, but they were never irreconcilable. We were always able to work it through.
Sort it out. Yeah.
Another area of interest was the women's thing. I was Minister of Women's Affairs, and Eugenia was a woman, and you would have thought that she would identify with that. But I remember one incident very graphically, when the issue of promotions within the police force was coming up. And there were some very good women who deserved promotion, but she was strongly opposed to promoting women in the police force. Why?
Really?
Because she thought that the women police officers, she didn't like the idea of women police officers to begin with. She thought the women police officers turned out to be nothing more than the playthings of the senior police officers. And she was opposed in principle to move them up.
It's quite a revelation coming from a woman who herself prided herself on being a very strong, independent, able to take care of herself kind of person.
But I suppose she didn't think that the women in the police were
able to do
character
that.
as she was. I mean, she was an extremely strong character.
Absolutely.
She would not have allowed herself to be. But she didn't have that confidence in the women. And it was an interesting relationship between her and me.
Let's see if we can cover in this segment. You in politics, you transit out of politics after 15 years. Bring us up to date. What happens after that? What takes you into your acting Chief Justice and position?
That's interesting. I had lost the election. The party had lost the election in 1995, and I became leader of the opposition and went back into my legal practice. Okay. Because during the period I was in politics, I was not practicing.
Of course.
I went back into my practice, and I appeared before the Court of Appeal on one occasion. It was a very short period of time. Yes. Sir Vincent Flosack was Chief Justice at the time. And there was a cocktail party put on by the Bar Association, which always happened in those days, for the visiting court. And Sir Vincent and one of his colleagues called me aside
Yes.
and asked me if I wasn't interested in joining the bench. I said, no way, that doesn't suit my character, my personality, my interest, and I really wasn't attracted. But they both pressed me. They asked me to consider it and so on. And I thought about it, spoke to some people, and decided, all right, let me apply.
Okay.
And actually, I've often reflected that it's the best decision I've ever made in my life.
Why so?
Well, it exposed me to a different perspective on the law and on the judiciary, and the work was very hard. I mean, the work of a judge is very challenging. First of all, I was a fairly social person, involved with all kinds of people and movements and activities. And the judiciary is a very isolating situation where you really remove yourself completely from
the society.
And you live a very isolated kind of life. And well, fortunately, in our judiciary, you don't stay at home generally.
Yeah.
So I moved immediately to Grenada, which was a society in which I was very familiar. I grew up and so on. And I had very close friends at the bar, Morris Bishop, Kenrick Radix, a number of others. But I had to remove myself from their society and from society in general. And I lived a rather isolated life, but that was good for me too. And the work was very challenging. I mean, as a judge, you sit in judgment on people and on events, and you have to balance. You have to look at the law, you have to look at the personalities involved and the events that happened, and come to a judgment based not on sentiment, but based on the evidence before you, your assessment of the veracity, the truthfulness of the parties, what the law is, and to some extent what is socially desirable, what will contribute to the growth of the society. So there are a lot of things you have to take into account. It's very demanding.
That sounds like a really challenging task,
It is.
because we're talking about here not on sentiment, on the law, but clearly on conscience, because you use the term socially, what is socially desirable. So you always have the interest of the broader society at heart. It's right there. That's what I'm taking from you. But yet you have to, in a sense, be making objective decisions about that. That sounds really difficult.
It is. And you know, one of the areas that I found particularly challenging, and the court, the judicial system, the legal system has also found challenging, is the issue of the death penalty.
Okay.
Yeah? In my career, I had been chairman of the Mercy Committee in Dominica. And one of my most difficult decisions was whether to apply the death penalty in a particular matter. And in those days, the jurisprudence hadn't developed to the point where it has now.
Okay.
And the death penalty was the mandatory sentence for murder. And the Mercy Committee then had to consider and advise and as chairman of the Mercy Committee, I had to make the ultimate decision and advise the president on action. And I did on one occasion advise the carrying out of the death penalty, a very difficult decision. I mean, you're talking of the life of an individual.
Sure.
So I did that. As the jurisprudence developed, the standards, the requirements for the imposition of the death penalty became more and more precise and more difficult. And as a judge, you have to decide. It was no longer the mandatory sentence. You now have to decide as a judge whether you impose the death penalty or whether you impose a life or other sentence.
How does a person handle that level of responsibility? Share with us a little bit. What goes through your mind at that time?
It's as I say, it's the most difficult decision to make. and I'm moving now from chairman of the Mercy Committee, where you make the ultimate
To make the decision, yes.
to a judge now, where you no longer have to administer the mandatory sentence. You now have to decide whether this man lives or dies, this person. And it's so difficult. There are certain legal principles applied, but those principles are so flexible.
Yeah.
The present jurisprudence says that the act of the murderer must be the worst of the worst. But what is the worst of the worst?
Exactly.
We have final appeals to the Privy Council. And in the context that the UK and Europe has abolished the death penalty, and our Privy Council is in that environment, in that mental state, there's hardly a case where they will justify the death penalty.
Okay.
And in fact, there's some cases which are really striking, that what I as an individual, and I think most Caribbean people would see as the worst of the worst case, has been overturned by the Privy Council. The death penalty has been removed.
Brian, we're going to take a break in a few seconds. You've brought us to a really interesting point in the conversation, because when we come back after that break, I want to task you to share with us now, given the current realities in our societies and world society about issues like of public governance, not just of the individual that you have to make decisions about, but we now have to make decisions, and courts have to make decisions about public governance, accountability, transparency, corruption, and so on. I want to take it into that realm a bit when we come back. So we're going to take a short break now from this reflections part of the conversation of George, Brian, Keith, ALLEYNE, also known as Brian ALLEYNE, Sir Brian. And when we come back, we'll ask him to dig a little deeper. Now we want to get some impressions, and maybe some suggestions as to where it's left him and where he thinks we as a society should be at this moment. We'll be right back. We're back, and we're back for a continuing conversation with Sir Brian. And I choose to use that title now because we're at a moment in the conversation where we want to talk about some of the bigger societal issues, the more encompassing umbrella type issues, like the regional ones, like the Caribbean Court of Justice, for example, Brian. This is high up on the regional agenda, or at least seems so. Talk to us a bit about what you see. What's Brian's view of CCJ and what it means for us as a region and where it is? Let's talk a bit about that.
Yes, I think the last conversation brought us directly into that, because law also has a lot to do with philosophy and the philosophy of society and how people see things. And I was talking about the Privy Council and its perspective as a European court, which in Europe the death penalty has been abolished a long time ago. So they have no tolerance for the death penalty, whereas we in the Caribbean, and I'm not talking necessarily of my personal view, we in the Caribbean still feel that the death penalty has a social value. So we have a court which is fundamentally opposed uncompromisingly to the death penalty. And we have a court which presumably reflects our own perspective on the death penalty. Yet the final court that we go to is the one that's very contrary to our perspective. And that's one argument that I have in favor of moving to the CCJ. And it's not only applies to the death penalty, but more broadly to our social perspective or view of life. So I'm really a very strong advocate of the CCJ. And I dismiss the issues that people have with the CCJ, that our courts cannot be unbiased, that we need to turn to the British for unbiased justice and so on. I think that's so totally wrong.
But is that what they're saying, though? The persons who critique the idea of the court are critiquing it not so much because they support the Privy Council as a court of last resort, but they seem to have concerns about what they see happening at the national level and how the politics and the partisanship appears to be influencing the courts here. Yes. And so what is to prevent that from happening at the regional level?
Yes, I appreciate that. And that's a whole different conversation. I mean, that's a very broad issue. But just to put it very simply, the persons who would reach the level of the CCJ would be of the highest caliber, both in terms of experience and in terms of character. The appointment process is very removed from any political influence. The bodies that make the appointments are not in any way politically connected. They're legal and judicial people and people from civil society. The whole structure of the court insulates it very, very carefully from political influences.
So is it then a matter of information, public information, and dialogue about what the court purports to do?
And I feel that there is not enough discussion on it. That people take positions, but there's no exchange, there's no interaction on it. I have said to attorneys general in the present government that any time they want to have a conversation, a public forum or whatever on the CCJ, I'd be happy to participate and to be part of it. Because I think we need a lot more information and we need to open our minds to the reality rather than making judgments on the basis of
And
prejudice.
that reality for you in terms of the rationale for the CCJ, you know, concisely put, would be what? Why is the CCJ a good idea for us?
Why is it a good idea for us? And also, why is it so is it structured in a way that it would be insulated from the political influences that people fear? And I think that's the core of the matter.
Okay.
That
and you're satisfied that a strong enough case can be made for that?
I think so.
I believe that should be a specific conversation that you should have with the public as well.
I'd like to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. But let's talk about, is there validity, though, to the concerns that people would have about governance issues as they may be or may have affected an important sector like the sector, the administration and dispensation of justice in the region? Are there concerns? They're legitimate.
Well, people in Dominica often refer to my own case as an example of that.
Yes.
So I'll tell you a little about the issues that a judge faces.
And just so that the viewers understand your own case, it's about your accession to being Chief Justice of the OECS Court and why you didn't move beyond the acting appointment.
Well, that's
what you're getting at, is it?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
So my first assignment as a judge was in Grenada. I was there for 6 years plus. The issues that came before me from time to time involved the government and the actions or inactions of the government. And on several occasions, I found myself deciding against the government's point of view on the thing. And I'm told that on one occasion, the Prime Minister actually commented, Prime Minister of the time, actually commented when he was told of a judgment that I had delivered. Brian, again? So, you know, that...
and of course you would have known the Prime Minister as a person as well, an individual person.
Yes. But apart from that, I would frequently visit him officially.
Yeah, as a judge.
As a judge, and have conversations about issues and so on. And on one occasion he asked me, why is it that you always find yourself deciding against me? I told him, Prime Minister, we really can't discuss that now.
Yes.
But after I retire, and maybe after you've retired, we can sit down and talk about it.
Have you had the conversation?
No, we have not.
Okay, because you're both retired.
Yes.
In a
Well,
way.
he hasn't retired.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay.
But I'm still happy to have the conversation
Wonderful.
with him, because
Okay.
I think he needs to understand my perspective. Not my perspective, but the perspective of the judiciary
Okay.
on these
Okay.
matters. And maybe I need to delve a little more deeply into his perspective as a politician, although that's no stranger to me, because I've been there as well.
Well, how does how do societies like ours, small, intimate knowledge of each other, closely knit, family-wise, and so, how do we kind of maintain the objectivity that seems so important to letting systems like the law and profession function well? How do we achieve that?
I don't pretend that that's not an issue. It is very much an issue. But one of the things that the judiciary of the Eastern Caribbean has done, it was particularly important for us because of the small societies in which we operate and the intimacy that potentially comes out of that situation, is to have annual conferences, continuing judicial education conferences, and to establish codes of ethics and things like that, which will sort of focus the attention of judges on their duty as judges. I think that's one of the great things that Sir Dennis Byron introduced to the judiciary, and he's now incidentally president of the CCJ.
Right.
So you know, he was very aware of these issues and these conflicts that exist in the judiciary, and we have developed over the years codes of ethics for our judiciary. I hope people look at them and consider them carefully. As you kind of translate your reflections into the impressions that you're sharing, I want to ask you to share with us, are we on a maturing path from where you sit now? You're retired, right? And you now have a chance to look back at the judiciary, to look back again at the society. So kind of you have an advantageous vantage point. Are we moving ahead, given what's happening all around us in the global society and the need for high levels of efficiency, ethics, values? Are we headed in that direction? What are the hurdles? In some ways, I'm afraid not. You know, society is changing a lot, and the awareness of the ethical considerations, the ethical standards and so on, are not strengthening, if you like. I mean, Eugenia Childs was very firm on ethics. You know, whatever criticisms you may have of her, Eugenia was committed to doing the right thing.
Above board.
As she saw it, above board.
Yeah.
You know, she would have dismissed any minister that she perceived to be corrupt or taking things under the table.
And she did.
So
and there was occasion when she did.
Yeah. I'm afraid that that doesn't appear to be as prevalent now as it was. It was not a, you know, people like John Compton and people like that would have been very firm on issues of that nature. I don't think that that's as much part of the principles that are applied as was in those days. So we need to develop a lot of ethical principles. And I was just reading something last night.
Yeah, what is?
It's in this magazine, The Parliamentarian, which is a magazine of parliamentarians.
Okay.
The Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. And the headline of the article is Principles and Guidelines for Constituency Development Funds. Now, we've recently established a system of constituency.
We have a ministry
development
responsible,
funds. Now, this is something that I had argued for when I was in government. I used to say to Eugenia, look, you know, the constituencies need particular attention by their representatives. And they need some resources to promote that. The village councils are part of that.
Yes.
But there's some places where there are no village councils, no local government. Eugenia was opposed to that. Now, I'm glad it has been introduced. My problem with it, and that's very much highlighted in this article, is the question of accountability and responsibility. public accountability, auditing of these funds. Who gets the funds? How are they administered? Is there an institutional arrangement to do that? These are some of the issues that I think we need to be addressing, and we are not addressing.
Okay.
Money is given out without any firm management of the funds. When a parliamentarian is given whatever money, whether it's $20 or $20,000, to apply to the development of his or her constituency, what happens to that money? Who gets it? Where does it go? Does it go into development, community development activities, or does it go into somebody's pocket, or is it distributed among supporters? I don't know. So the institutional arrangements for accountability are so crucial, and I find that's absent.
Many would argue that there's a clear role for persons like yourself, civil society persons, etc., to be, if you will, the voice and conscience, to speak up, to address the very kinds of issues forthrightly, as you've just done, and lament the fact that it appears that compared with the 60s and 70s and maybe 80s, there's a dearth, a shortage of that kind of forthright engagement by the professionals in the society, including your profession. On these kinds of issues, people say is controversial, leading maybe possible fears of victimization and so on. What's your take on that? How important is it for the profession of law, bar association and so on, to engage, to continue to be engaged in these issues so that they do in fact mature?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that I get myself into trouble every time I open my mouth on these issues. And that's been my life. From my very early days, I spoke about the dread era.
Of course, of course.
And I find that professional organizations like the bar and so on are too far removed from these issues. You know, everything seems to be focused on the personal interests and, you know, the financial advancement and social acceptability and so on. And I think the professions, and in particular the legal profession, should be speaking about standards, about accountability, about respect for the law and for the Constitution. But you don't hear anything.
What has happened, Brian? What has happened to drop the door of silence on a profession like that?
I suppose people are becoming more and more interested in making money, living up to the Joneses, being part of the prosperous society. And people are not prepared to take risks, they're not prepared to sacrifice. They go along. I suppose people want to be in favor rather than take independent positions, which is regrettable. I mean, and the legal profession in particular needs to follow a code of ethics, and not only institutional ethics, but personal ethics as well. Every individual lawyer needs to look at himself. I mean, we've got away with so many things. The issue of taking clients' money, and you get away with it.
No penalties.
And not only that, you migrate to another jurisdiction and you become a lawyer there, and you probably do the same thing there. So I think the ethical standards of the profession and personal ethics are what we need to be really focusing on.
Which actually would migrate into the fact that the society as a whole, as an organism, the society itself seems to have kind of, you know, stepped back a few paces from adherence to these kinds of ethics and principles that kind of, I guess, we knew as children growing up. And it raises a question which I'd like us to sort of address when we come back after this short break. Where should we be going and how? I want you to sort of, without being prescriptive, that's not your style anyhow, any suggestions you have as things that we could as a society or as a profession, as a group of, in terms of the law profession, what can we be doing? What could we be doing? What should we be doing? If we are to not only salvage these ethics, principles, values and so on, but also to grow them into a mature society as we take our full place, you know, in the League of Nations of the world. And we're going to have that segment of the conversation when we come back after this short break from the sponsors of this program who make the conversation with Sir Brian possible. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back, and unfortunately, sadly, the last segment of our conversation is Sir Brian. Obviously, we have to bring him back here for some further discussion. But Brian, let's share with us, where do we go and how do we go there as a society? What should we be seeking to recapture, to nurture, if we are to kind of, really earn our keep, earn our right as a full nation?
Yeah. Our reality is that we're a very small society, and in small societies, social pressures are very powerful. And that is why, one of the reasons why I've always advocated a broader society. In other words, I've always supported the idea of OECS, nation of the OECS, where the very personal issues that govern our politics, for instance, will be neutralized or countered by the fact that we have a broader electorate and the need to for politicians to influence people not only in the very small village and community, but more broadly.
And more issue-focused.
More issue-focused,
yeah. Yes.
So I've always been and continue to be an advocate of what we used to call OECS unity.
Right.
The nation of the OECS.
Okay.
And I think that would help us a lot in a number of areas having to do with governance, politics, judiciary, and so on. Our judiciary is a good example of that.
Okay.
We have realized that it would be very difficult to have a Dominica judiciary or a St. Lucia judiciary. So we have an OECS judiciary.
It's a working model, you think?
It's a good working model.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. So that I, as a judge, never worked in Dominica at the trial level.
Okay.
I worked at the appeal level. But that removed me from the personal interchange with people with whom I had intimate relationships. And I think the same principle applies to the question of governance at the political level. That we should broaden our constituency to being an OECS constituency rather than a Dominica constituency or I know I'm, in a sense, spinning top in mud, and maybe the days for that are long past, I don't know.
But there must be a reason why you stick to that view, that vision. What continues to drive you to believe what you believe about the regional option?
Well, you see, again, we come back to the same issue of the then Prime Minister of Grenada,
right.
Brian again, right? So everything is very intimate. And I don't know for a fact that the then Prime Minister blocked my appointment as Chief Justice.
But you know it didn't happen.
It didn't happen.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of belief that that is why it didn't happen. So I'm not claiming that I merited the appointment in any way beyond, but these are the things that influence our institutions and our governance, the smallness and the intimacy of our relationships. So I stick to that view because I think it's a practical view. It will help our development. It will broaden our economies. We would, you know, if for instance, I recently needed some car parts. The agency here didn't have them. They had to buy them from an agency in St. Lucia. Okay. The price at which I paid for those car parts is tremendous because the St. Lucia agency, I suppose, had to have their markup. Perhaps they paid duty on it, I don't know. It had to be brought here. The local agency had to have its markup. And all these things multiply. Now, if we had
a single economic space
arrangement, economics, yes. All these things would benefit the society at large, not me personally, but all of us. By having a broader society.
You know, I'm reminded of the advice that he always gave us as younger professionals. I speak of the late William D. Mass, who I'm sure you know, you knew, president of the CDB, first Secretary General of, CARICOM and so on. He always said, he said, Ati, it always boils down to a question of vision. I said, but you're an economist. What are you talking about vision? He said, yeah. It is the vision that is the driver of the talent. Mm-hmm. If you know where you're going, and of course, I hear you saying the same thing. You see the possibility of a united group of countries creating one nation. And that seems to color, shape, drive the commitment you have to a unified law sector and, of course, a unified society. Yeah. And I don't know if this is a correct assessment of what's the driver for Brian ALLEYNE.
It very much is. And I see it not only as a possibility, but actually almost as a necessity. Right. That we can't. And I suppose that has something to do with my own personal history. True. Having grown up in Dominica, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Grenada. Right. So I, in a sense, have a regional vision and perspective.
Well, it seems that it is, you join actually what I call an eminent group of persons, and I'm referring to Calypsonians, who for decades have seen that vision very clearly and sang about it. Black Stallion and so many others from Trinidad, all the way up. You can find calypsos that reflect that. So, Brian, I want to thank you.
Unfortunately, I can't sing a note.
Well, actually, you can speak a note. I want to thank you, Brian, taking time. I know, you are busy, although you're retired. It doesn't, seem to gel. But thank you.
Retired means tired twice.
There you go. I love that. But thank you, Brian, and I want to thank you, the viewers, for kind of being there and sharing in this conversation with us. As you can see, there's a lot more to come from Sir Brian, and we are happy to have him back home with us. We will be sharing him and his ideas in future with you. Thank you so much. See you next time.